Welcome to Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now you can learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property. Learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landaw with the Mineola law firm of Shane, Dox, Denisi, and Corker. He's a member of the Committee on Professional Ethics of the Bar Association of Nassau County and counsel to the Nassau Academy of Law. And now, here is your host for Law You Should Know, attorney Kenneth J. Landaw.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. We have two special guests tonight, and they are the attorneys behind this Staircase and also Making a Murderer, very popular shows on, across the country on Netflix. They will also be appearing live in New York at Westbury Theatre on January 12th. So they're going to give us a behind-the-scenes look at some of the things they'll talk about that night, where they'll take people behind the scenes into how police and prosecutors tip the scales of justice and how, there are many wrongful convictions. And these are true crime documentaries that detail how people are wrongfully convicted. Very sad chapter in American history, and it's still going on now. David and Jerry, welcome to Law You Should Know.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
David, just take a moment to tell us about The Staircase.
Well, The Staircase is a documentary that it actually was started filming in 2002. The filmmakers filmed the original trial, which occurred in 2003, as well as all the preparations leading up to it. It's a real behind-the-scenes look into how a defense is prepared. They then came back in 2011 when we got Mr. Peterson a new trial. Peterson is the defendant in the case. And then they came back again in 2016 when we finally resolved the case. So it's literally a 15-year odyssey in a murder case involving a author by the name of Michael Peterson, who was accused of murdering his wife, who was found at the bottom of a staircase in the couple's very extensive home in Durham, North Carolina.
And the program and the presentation that you're bringing to New York City and Long Island is going to really explain how you brought this to Netflix and all kinds of behind-the-scenes information.
What we're going to be talking about is, number one, how this documentary came to be made, because it's a very unusual documentary. It's really the first of its kind, and then Making a Murderer came along and popularized it. So we're going to be talking about how and why we allowed the documentary to be made. And then with regard to The Staircase, we're going to be talking about a number of the issues that the documentary raises, including junk science, which was a big part of the problem in the case. And I think a big part of the problem in the criminal justice system in the United States today.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. But Jerry, tell us about your book.
Yeah, the name of the book is Illusion of Justice: Inside Making a Murderer in America's Broken System. And it's sort of a combination memoir of my career and a discussion of Making a Murderer, the Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey cases, and the flaws that documentary revealed about American justice and how those similar flaws really happen all over America all the time. And I talk about a number of other cases that I've handled during my career that illustrate the same issues. And then I also discuss, towards the end, some ideas I have and suggestions for how we can all take responsibility to improve and reform our criminal justice system. Some of them sort of individual, easy things that we can try. Others collectively will take a little longer to do. But I do think that there's a groundswell movement these days to try and reform the problems in American criminal justice.
Dave, you had talked about some of the junk science. So what are, people hear about DNA and forensic science. Is it more fiction than fact?
No, well, I think there's some valid forensic science, and certainly DNA is sort of the gold standard when it comes to forensic science. But there are a lot of so-called forensic sciences which really aren't sciences at all. So, for example, blood spatter is the primary culprit in the staircase, and there are some things that a blood spatter expert can validly tell you in terms of directionality and a few indicators that the physics of blood and blood spatter can indicate. But the problem is that oftentimes these experts go far beyond what the science justifies. And it's not just blood spatter; it's things like tire impressions and tool mark impressions, and dental impressions and hair comparisons. All of the forensic sciences that really don't have any standards by which they are judged, but rather they're fairly subjective. They're sort of practiced mostly by police officers who have gotten their training in 40-hour courses and then sort of on-the-job training from other people who had 40-hour courses. And that's really the problem, is that you have a lot of science or evidence masquerading as science that really isn't scientific at all.
And sometimes it has an adverse impact on our criminal justice system.
Oftentimes it has an adverse impact. For example, with regard to hair comparison, the FBI has now conceded that its own hair comparison unit was wrong something like 95% of the time, and a number of those people testified in trials. A number of state hair comparison experts were trained by the FBI, and so you probably have hundreds, if not thousands, of cases in the United States where evidence regarding hair comparison was admitted to evidence that probably never should have been. And I can't tell you that all of those instances resulted in wrongful convictions, but I know personally that at least one did, and I represented a client who ended up spending 25 years in prison based on a hair comparison that was simply false.
Well, and one of the things that we do know about flawed forensic science is that it is a major contributor to wrongful convictions. We've had enough exonerations now by DNA, and that people have gone back and studied those cases and said, well, now what went wrong? What were the factors? Probably the biggest single factor of wrongful convictions is erroneous eyewitness identification. But close behind that is false confessions, flawed forensic science, and police and prosecutorial misconduct. And so, there's a lot of different legs to the stool that bring about wrongful conviction in this country, and certainly forensic science, in part because, if you think about it, most jurors are not that knowledgeable about science. Most Americans aren't that knowledgeable about science, and we think we know from Hollywood's version of crime dramas like CSI or Law and Order that the cases are easily solved by objective scientific evidence, and that just is not the case. With the exception of DNA, the vast majority of almost everything else really is a subjective comparison of crime scene evidence with evidence samples that are taken from one or more suspects, and it's a subjective call with little standards, little control, poor training, and it varies dramatically from one part of the country to the next as well. So it's an area that is illustrated very well in the staircase, and you see some of it in Making a Murderer as well when you see the never before used test for EDTA, a chemical preservative in blood, that the FBI comes up with on the fly, and by the way has never used since or before. So it's these kinds of things can make a big difference in contributing to wrongful convictions.
Is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
Well, I think one of the things that both Jerry and I have been concerned about is movements towards reform. There was some movement towards reform under the Obama administration. There was a big report that was done in 2009 by the National Academy of Sciences. President Obama appointed an advisory panel to help address these issues. It was disbanded as soon as Jeff Sessions took over the Justice Department. And Jerry has now established a center for the integrity of forensic science, and hopefully that may start to bring some standards into the field once again.
And this is really not a red or a blue issue. This is about the integrity of the criminal justice system and that the people aren't wrongfully locked up.
Absolutely, because it's important to keep in mind that if the wrong person is convicted and the crime occurred, then that means the real perpetrator went free. And that's in nobody's interest to punish the innocent and allow the guilty to go free. And there really has been a bipartisan movement until very, very recently on the federal level and state level, and even after the Jeff Sessions Justice Department sort of slowed down the reform on forensic science on the federal level, there continues to be reform all over the country at the state level. Texas is actually leading the country, frankly, in forensic science reform. And there's bipartisan support in Congress for all kinds of other criminal justice reforms, including there's a bill that's pending right now that is really just waiting for a floor vote in the Senate before it passes.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now. When we return, we will continue our discussion and focus on police and prosecutorial misconduct and what your experiences are about that and other things that you're going to cover at your program about the staircase and making a murderer coming to New York and Long Island. You're listening to Law You Should Know here on 90.3, the voice of Nassau Community College, and also over the internet at nccradio.org, and we'll be back in a moment.
This show is brought to you by the NYCB Theatre at Westbury, who presents Inside the Staircase and Making a Murderer, Fabrications, Lies, and the Owl Theory, featuring lawyer David Rudolf from the Netflix show The Staircase, and lawyer Jerry Buting from Making a Murderer on Saturday, January 12th at 8 p.m. More information can be found online at thetheateratwestbury.com.
This program is brought to you by Nassau Community College, which offers a paralegal studies program. Students can major in paralegal studies while earning their associate's degree, or earn a paralegal certificate if they already have a college degree. These programs can even help you start a second career as a paralegal. It's a program for anyone who wants to work in a law office assisting lawyers, the government, or a position in an insurance company. More information about full-time, part-time, days, evenings, weekends, or online courses is available by calling 516-572-7774 or by email at paralegal@ncc.edu.
Once again, we continue with Law You Should Know. From the Mineola Law Firm of Shane, Doxton, Easy, Corker, and Sauer, here is attorney Kenneth J. Landaw.
Hi, this is Ken Landaw, and welcome back to Law You Should Know. We're talking with attorneys David Rudolf from The Staircase on Netflix and Jerry Buting, the author of Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer and America's Broken System, published by Harper in 2017. And they'll be coming to New York City and Long Island in early January to discuss the whole nature of criminal justice system and separate fact from fiction. David, you've talked about DNA evidence and how forensic evidence is not so reliable, but let's talk for a moment about police and prosecutorial misconduct.
The real problem stems from what we would call tunnel vision. It's when police in particular, and sometimes prosecutors, develop a theory about who's guilty. Sometimes it's way too early for them to develop that theory, but they do it anyway. And then they develop tunnel vision about their theory. And that means that they ignore the evidence that's inconsistent with their theory, and they inflate the importance of the evidence that they feel is consistent with their theory. And that's, I think, at root of most of the wrongful convictions that end up occurring as a result of police misconduct. I don't think the police are setting out to frame innocent people. But I think when they let their tunnel vision get the better of them, we end up with prosecutions that are not fact-based, but rather theory-based, and that's a real problem.
And would you like to add something on that?
Well, let me actually just go back for a minute and clarify a little bit about how our event is structured. It's a Q&A, so we really encourage questions from the audience. David and I have spoken to a number of cities now, and one of the things we like to do is tailor it to the interests of that particular audience on that particular night. And so you can email questions in advance, or you can submit your questions on the night of the show, and we really try and pick as many of those as possible to address the issues that people who are there in the audience have. Now, that can be specific questions about either making a murderer or the staircase, or it can be broader criminal justice issues like police and prosecutorial misconduct, flawed forensic science, wherever the audience wants to take us.
And I guess you can also tell them how some of the science that they might see on other TV shows isn't quite as accurate as they may think,
yes,
or as it may be presented.
Yes, absolutely. We talk about that. And we also, people have specific questions about these documentaries, because things that were shown or weren't shown, there's been a lot of debate in social media, and people have questions. Well, why wasn't this covered in a documentary, and what about this piece of evidence and that piece of evidence? And both of these cases were very, very long trials, and so you only get part of what really happens before the trial and during the trial and after the trial. You get the majority of critical pieces of evidence are discussed in both documentaries, but there are always other issues that people have and questions they've got that we're willing to talk about as well.
And even if someone's not familiar with your show, it's a chance to learn more about our criminal justice system, about forensic science, and wrongful convictions, which everyone should be concerned about.
Well, that's true, but I think the vast majority of the folks who end up coming to the show are at least familiar with the two documentaries, Making a Murderer and The Staircase. And oftentimes people will binge watch it in the week before coming to the show. A lot of people have heard about these documentaries. A lot of people have them on their watch list if they haven't already seen them. And what we found is that sometimes simply buying the ticket and deciding to come to the show ends up prompting them to go ahead and actually pull the trigger and watch the series in a few days.
What are some of the most interesting questions that you've been asked at these programs that you've been conducting around the country or around the world?
One of the issues that I've been focused on is the burden of proof and how verdicts are expressed in the United States versus in other places. So, for example, in Scotland, there's a verdict that's known as not proven, which is in addition to a not guilty or a guilty. So they actually have three separate verdicts that are possible in Scotland. From my perspective, I think the not proven verdict is probably the one that most accurately reflects what a jury is supposed to be determining, which is whether or not the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. So, we've had a lot of questions about those sorts of issues. And then, of course, there's just a lot of questions about, for example, interrogation tactics, because in Making a Murderer, one of the primary issues is the interrogation of a 16-year-old.
We also get a lot of questions about what it's like to be a criminal defense attorney, why we do what we do, how we do what we do. Do we have to believe that our clients are innocent in order to defend them? These are all questions that people wonder about, and it's one of the reasons I wrote my book. Is I talk. It's also sort of the making of a criminal defense attorney, and how I became interested in this career, and why I love what I do, and why I think it's a noble calling. And it's one of the things that I think David and I have both found most rewarding about our talks is how much people have come to appreciate the value of a criminal defense attorney and the important role that we play in our justice system. Whereas all too often Hollywood portrays a criminal defense attorney as the bad guy, and the police and the prosecutors are always the good guys getting the guilty people. People understand when they see these documentaries, when they read my book, and they hear us talk, that it's not that way at all. That it's just as honorable and important to be a defense attorney as it is a prosecutor. You can do justice on both sides, and so I found that one of the most rewarding things about going around and talking to people.
And the both of you and all other criminal defense attorneys out there are the real guardians of our criminal justice system.
Well, I think it's even broader than that. I think to a large extent, we're the people who stand between the abuse of power by the government and the everyday citizen. And so it often falls to us in the criminal justice system to be that guardian, as you put it. The problem these days is that the rule of law is under attack in all kinds of situations, and hopefully people realize that criminal justice is an important issue, and that criminal defense lawyers are, in fact, not just defending the guilty, but defending the rule of law and making sure that the abuse of power is not inflicted on everyday citizens.
And you mentioned burden of proof before. Is that part of your role to make sure the prosecutor proves their case based on the highest standard?
It is, absolutely. And every case is different. And, some cases it's more clear-cut than others. But the prosecution too often in America these days sort of starts off with almost a presumption of guilt because often because of pretrial publicity or just the nature of the charge might be enough that when people come in and sit down, they're sort of thinking, well, this person must have done something wrong or they wouldn't be here. And that's, of course, completely backwards from the way our justice system was designed, with a presumption of innocence and the state having the entire burden of proof. So it helps to have a fair and balanced judge who can also explain that to the jurors so that they understand the proper burden. But it's absolutely necessary that the defense, at every opportunity, remind the jurors and challenge the state's case so that they really do have to convince individual jurors beyond a reasonable doubt of guilt before someone is convicted.
Just, we only have a moment or two left in the show, and I'm sure anyone who attends your program will learn much more, and it's great for someone who's involved or concerned about the criminal justice system and our democracy. Who do you think will especially enjoy the program and find it very interesting? Obviously not just attorneys.
No, I think as a matter of fact, anyone who has taken a real interest in the criminal justice system, and these days, true crime has become a very, very popular genre, both in literature and on social media and movies and TV. And so I think anyone who has enjoyed true crime series or documentaries, who's into that sort of genre, will find it really interesting. I would say, the vast majority of people that do come to these talks are not lawyers. We certainly have some that do attend as well, but they are people from all different walks of life who just have an interest in justice and are really looking for a real, true explanation of what happens in the courts, not just what they see in fictional Hollywood television and movie portrayals. So I think all kinds of people, all different ages, can appreciate this.
And really, anyone who watches any of those criminal procedurals even on regular broadcast TV.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people are really sort of shocked when they understand how different the reality is from what is shown on TV as a regular basis.
Okay. I wish we had some more time, but I would like to thank criminal defense attorneys David Rudolf from The Staircase and Jerry Buting from Making a Murderer. And the full book, and you can always pick up the book as well, is Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer and America's Broken Systems. And as you've heard, you can bid and watch these programs on Making a Murderer or The Staircase, and come to the program on January 11th in the Gramercy Theatre in Lower Manhattan, and here at Westbury Theatre on January 12th. Just Google the programs or Google Live Nation for more information on getting tickets. You're listening to Law You Should Know here on WHPC 90.3, the voice of Nassau Community College, and also over the internet at nccradio.org. And this program and many others are available as podcasts without charge by going to nccradio.org.